Hello and welcome to this long-term reading project where every week we read a section of Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain. My name is David, and if you're here for the first time, I would recommend to take a look at this playlist first to watch the previous videos that give you a good introduction into the novel and helps you to catch up with our little travel group up that magic mountain. How does this project work? So every week we read a section of about 30 pages, and in this weekly video I do not give a very detailed description of the plot and what happened. I will make a very quick summary of what happened, and then I will go into the details. I will share with you my observations of things that came to me while reading the novel or while doing some additional research and additional background material and so on. Okay, so this week we read the fourth and fifth section of chapter 5, and these sections were entitled Whims of Mercurius and Encyclopaedic, at least in the English translation that I am reading. What happens in this section? So Hans experiences the ups and downs, the roller coaster of emotions into which his infatuation with Claudia Chauchat takes him, and so that means that the smallest gestures and remarks, the most trivial things during their encounters, and sometimes these encounters are accidental, sometimes they are deliberately brought about by Hans. The smallest details in these encounters can either delight him or sadden him to death. And so Hans behaves rather awkwardly and clumsily, literally like a teenager in love. And he is also completely indifferent to the fact that he is making a fool of himself in the eyes of his fellow patients with his clumsy attempts to attract Claudia's attention. He even runs the risk of offending some of his fellow patients and also his cousin Joachim, because he instrumentalizes them for his own purpose. In the last video, I described my impression that Hans is now going through some stage of a late puberty, at least sort of a mental puberty. And in the section with the title Encyclopaedic, I think we get a clear demonstration of something like an adolescent rebelliousness. There is a lengthy conversation between Hans and Settembrini, which certainly takes on the character of a hot argument, in which Hans is not only, he does not only contradict Settembrini, but he downright provokes Settembrini with his arguments at some points. But okay, one thing after the other. Today I would like to address 5 points to which I have given the titles of popular pop songs, just for fun. So number 1, Love is in the Air. So we learn a little bit about how Hans' love is focused mainly on the physical aspect. Number 2, I'm your Venus, I'm your fire. Let's talk a little bit about Venus, Mercury, and Cupid. Number 3, Autumn Leaves. We learn a bit about biological symbolism. Number 4, As Time Goes By. What about proper management of time? Number 5, Body and Soul. So the body and mind dualism of Settembrini. We're going to look into that in with a bit more detail. Okay, let's start with number 1, Love is in the Air. A few observations about Hans' infatuation. At the Berghof sanatorium, Hans' infatuation with Claudia Chauchat is nothing out of the ordinary, nothing special. Affairs between patients were absolutely common at the Berghof. These processes, flirtations and erotic adventures, they formed, I quote, they formed a main part of the local atmosphere, and Hans could be sure of a general understanding. So I think this is hardly surprising when people in their prime age spend their days together for weeks and months or even years, and they always have a lot of free time to think about themselves and about their fellow patients. I think we can also gather from the numerous allusions and side comments that there was a rather permissive atmosphere at the Berghof, helped by the fact that it was quite easy to visit your neighbors, even unnoticed by the sanatorium officials, by using the passageways on the balconies. And okay, there are two aspects that I consider worth mentioning with a bit more detail. Firstly, I think it becomes quite clear in these sections that Hans' infatuation was not a cozy romantic crush like the one talked of in the little song that Hans was humming in one of the first chapters. But Hans' infatuation really relates quite specifically to Claudia Chauchat's physicality. So it's really the eroticism is at the core of it. We see that in many literal remarks and gestures. Also, there's one passage where the narrator virtually follows Hans' gaze or his inner fantasies when Hans is looking on Mrs. Chauchat's knees and the line of her leg and on her back, her neck vertebrae and her upper arms that compressed her small breasts. Secondly, there is again a tension by means of contrasts, of ambivalence. It is the tension between lust and death. The erotic activities at the Berghof, they seem like a desperate dance on a volcano. It is a rebellion of lust for life in the face of, or precisely despite of, the ever-present danger of death. Because all the patients here at the Berghof, they have the threat of death before their eyes, both for themselves, but also for their objects of desire, or their loved ones. And Thomas Mann expresses this in a sort of disguised way. He says, he wrote that this manner and jest seemed out of place. It made one's teeth to chatter and took away one's breath. They betrayed themselves too plainly for what they were, a thin and obvious disguise for a hidden extremity, or rather an extremity impossible to hide. I see a second ambivalence in the attitude of the fellow patients towards the people involved in love affairs here. On the one hand, it is a spectacle that is met with a strange mixture of indulgence and gossip. On the one hand, so understanding for the all too human need for love, that's one aspect, but there's also a lot of unconcealed malice when observing the ridiculousness of how some of these patients that have a crush on somebody, how they behave. So both of these attitudes are present here, and Hans is not an exception. He is not spared this either. So there's something like, I quote, like an outward confirmation and assertion of his inner frenzy. So there's sort of understanding, but it also came to this, that people actually stood about in groups to observe the infatuated youth. So here too we see Thomas Mann's usual ambiguous play, who adds the complementary contrast to almost every posture, every movement, and thus keeps the anti-action in a permanent state of suspension. Let's move on to point number 2. I'm your Venus. Of course, Thomas Mann also plays with various references to mythology in these sections. For me, this is most obvious in the description of the morning walk, where Hans and Joachim meet or overtake Madame Chauchat. The description of Madame Chauchat is quite striking. I quote from the text: Frau Chauchat in white, a white sweater and white flannel skirt, even white shoes. Her red blonde hair gleamed in the morning sun. So here Thomas Mann uses a color palette that, at least in the European painting since the Renaissance, more or less, a palette that since those days is very clearly and specifically associated with female deities, preferably goddesses of love, or at least erotically attractive female heroines. So this reddish hair in combination with a white clothing. Let me show you a few examples. I think probably the best known one is the first one, The Birth of Venus, painted by Botticelli, I think painted around 1485. So the goddess of love, Venus, is depicted here with reddish blonde hair. And although she herself is not dressed in white clothing, her skin is strikingly white, and she is born from a white shell. And at least the equally reddish blonde female companion on the right-hand side is wearing a white dress. Oh, this picture by Tizian, painted around 30 years later in 1515. It's entitled Heavenly and Earthly Love, or Heavenly and Profane Love. So two women with reddish blonde hair, one of them with a white dress, and the second one, at least, with a white sort of loincloth. And Tizian used this reddish blonde hair color so often in his paintings that even the technical term Tizian red became established for it, became coined after the color he used for reddish blonde hair. But this is not just a fashion or a transient phenomenon of Renaissance painting. It continues throughout the centuries. Here are just two pictures from the Victorian Romantic period, so they are much closer to the time when the novel The Magic Mountain was written. The first one is Lady Lilith, painted in 1865 by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Or here a detail of the painting The Accolade, painted in 1901 by Edmund Blair Leighton. So over the centuries, we find numerous examples of how the combination of white clothing and reddish or reddish blonde hair in female figures has established itself as a kind of common pictorial topos, common pictorial theme, which is often used to depict love, a goddess of love, or an erotically connotated female figure, usually from mythology. And the most obvious connection of this kind is, of course, Venus, the ancient Roman goddess of love. And that this description of Madame Chauchat with this white clothing and reddish blonde hair as a goddess, that this is justified, I think this is supported by two observations from the text. First, when Hans overtakes Madame Chauchat on the hike, he greets her profoundly respectful. And in the German original, this word, this respectfulness is in a twofold way emphasized. First, by italicizing the word respectful, and by the narrator's subsequent rhetorical question. So it put in parentheses, so why actually profoundly respectful? So in other words, the narrator is really pointing the reader to the fact that this is something special, to really make it clear to the reader that Madame Chauchat is not just seen and greeted as a normal person, but really as a sort of a higher being to whom Hans pays homage and is reverent, like towards a deity. And this mythological aspect, this reference to the ancient gods, is also reinforced in the following paragraph when Hans' gait, his mode of walking, is described as being on winged feet. So winged feet is a very clear and unique attribute of the ancient god Mercury. it's sort of his trademark or his distinguishing mark as the messenger of God. So in the tradition, there are two variants here. Sometimes Mercury is depicted with a winged helmet or with winged feet, or sometimes with both. So, and both of them are really clear references to Mercury. So, and now we have two elements together. We have a reference to a Venus and a reference to Mercury. So Thomas Mann draws a connection to a motive that was, at least in his days, he could take it for granted that this was well known by the educated classes, namely the picture of Venus and Mercury together with Amor or Cupid, the other god of love. So it's a motive that is called sometimes the so-called school of love. It's a motive that is was quite often depicted in the visual arts by showing Venus and Mercury together and suggesting their love relationship by also adding as a third person Cupid, the god of love, usually depicted as a child. Nowadays, I think we readers of today, we do not make this connection immediately because we are so flooded by pictures and images nowadays. But I think we should keep in mind that at the time the novel was written, the classically educated citizens of Thomas Mann's times, they had probably seen just a few thousand paintings and pictures in their lifetime. So the few pictures they had seen, they had a fresher memory of them, and knowledge of the most important paintings, particularly of the Renaissance, was just simply part of the educational curriculum. So the somewhat more educated readers of his time, if they understood the allusions to Venus and Mercury, I'm certain that many of them had images like these in their mind, and they understood the meaning that they transported. So this is a painting of this sort, with this motive, School of Love by Correggio, the Italian painter, painted around 1525. We see a Venus, red-haired. We see Mercury with wings on his helmet and on his shoes or on his feet, and we see the little Cupid. So here, this is a depiction from a later one from the 18th century. So again, the red-haired Venus with a white dress and Mercury with wings. So we see the wings only at his helmet here, and the Cupid. And so this was a widespread and popular motif. It even made it into the showcases of the somewhat wealthier bourgeoisie as sort of knick-knack figurines made of Meissen porcelain, like the example I can show you here in this picture. So, Whims of Mercurius. I think this is a rather ambiguous title for this section. On the one hand, on the surface, on the material level, it can be read as just an expression of Hans' fluctuating body temperature. So, body temperature measured with a thermometer that contains mercury. So, and this temperature is first rising and then, to his horror, it's falling again. So it's sort of whimsical, and there's a danger of that this falling temperature degrades him from a legitimate patient to an almost healthy person and nobody. So, but on the other hand, Hans himself is depicted as a Mercury with the clear attribute of the winged feet, a Mercury who allows himself to be drawn by Venus into the love game, or someone who rather fantasizes himself into it. So Whims of Mercurius can also be a reference to the ups and downs of Hans' emotions, depending on whether his attempts to attract Claudia's attention are successful or not, whether he's ignored. But Thomas Mann turns the screw just one turn further and adds another contrast or element to this game of mythological allusions. And this happens in the section Encyclopaedia. It happens through the mouth of Settembrini, because Settembrini sees the situation as anything but a harmless love idyll. He sees a danger. He warns Hans that the Berghof is an island of Kirke, and that Hans is in danger of going on all fours, and presently he will begin to grunt. So in other words, Hans will become a pig. And this is an allusion to the Odyssey by Homer, where Odysseus or Ulysses and his companions, they land on the island of Kirke. Kirke was a goddess, or sort of a witch-like goddess, who transformed her visitors into animals in order to make them more submissive. And according to the legend, as written by Homer, Ulysses' companions are turned into pigs by Kirke. So Settembrini, therefore, he does not regard Madame Chauchat as a Venus, as a pure and innocent goddess of love, but he sees her as a real danger to Hans, and he makes this unmistakably clear by using a very unsettling comparison with another Greek goddess, with Kirke. And yeah, who can be surprised that also Kirke, like Venus, is often depicted in paintings with the same attributes, like white clothing and reddish hair, or at least with always one of these two attributes. So a naive person like Hans might actually mistake the one for the other. So that's the danger that Settembrini is alluding to. There are a couple of paintings of Kirke. I showed just a few examples. This is my favorite painting of Kirke. It's my favorite one in this context of the novel The Magic Mountain, because it's, on the one hand, it's a very beautiful painting of this enigmatic and sort of threatening red-headed Kirke, with an almost cat-like head posture, and the shoulders and neck bent round to the front, and the hair pinned up. And I'm sure it's a coincidence, but all these little aspects of her posture actually match quite nicely the description of Claudia Chauchat's posture, the way she holds her shoulders and her arms and her head, and the hairstyle with the hair pinned up. And this is nicely matches her description as in The Magic Mountain. Okay, so when Settembrini mentions Kirke, he does so because he sees the danger of Hans falling into decadence through his infatuation with Claudia Chauchat, and not making only a fool of himself, but also disgracing himself and losing all dignity. Two little fun facts to conclude this topic. The first one is, I really tell you with a tongue-in-cheek attitude. With regards to women with reddish hair, I would like to share with you a completely off-topic quote from Mark Twain that actually has nothing to do with the Magic Mountain novel, but which nicely links to Madame Chauchat's red hair and her often mentioned cat-like nature. And the quote by Mark Twain goes like this: "Why the rest of the species," he refers to the human species, so while the rest of the species is descended from apes, redheads are descended from cats. Okay, let's move on back to the more serious topic of mythology. In the Odysseus saga, Odysseus is able to avoid being enchanted by Kirke thanks to a magic herb that protects him. And he receives this protective magic herb from whom? He receives it from the god Hermes. And Hermes, if you remember one of the previous videos, Hermes is just the Greek version of Mercury. It's just the Greek name for the same god. So now the narrator has performed a triple somersault in mythology, because Hans himself stands for Mercury in this section. So we can interpret, I think a possible interpretation is that he himself has the power within himself to protect himself from this spell, to free himself from this spell. That, at least, I think, is an interpretation that would suit the Enlightenment philosopher Settembrini, because this is very much in the spirit of the Enlightenment, almost exactly like the German philosopher Immanuel Kant defined enlightenment. Like, use your own understanding, your own mental powers to free yourself from your self-imposed immaturity. Okay, so we could start another long philosophical digression here, but let's move on to the third agenda item for today. The third section of the title, Autumn Leaves. So after this ride through the ancient world of gods, it's time for a change, for something down to earth. And I mean down to earth quite literally. Let's take a look at the ground, at the soil. For what does the narrator tell us about the autumnal flora on the mountain meadows of the magic mountain surrounding the Berghof? I'll now jump back to the first 2 pages of the section Whims of Mercurius. Thomas Mann describes the autumn that is now arriving in the mountain world in October. And after a few sentences that are a little bit up in the sky about the glory of the sky over mountain and valley, and a few words about unexpectedly warm sunny days, now the glance goes down to earth. And then there follows a section with details about botany. So a tree species and a couple of flowering plants are suddenly mentioned and named. And you could mistake this for a quite harmless chit-chatter, like just a chatty narrator showing off his botanical knowledge. But appearances are deceptive in this novel, as always. So this section is introduced that the narrator will start to talk about, quote, wild flowers speaking though softly. So these flowers are speaking though softly. So they have something to tell. They have a meaning. So that means they're not just randomly selected representatives of the Swiss mountain flora. All these are flowers carefully selected by Thomas Mann. And we will soon see that they were selected because they all have a very specific symbolic meaning that matches very well with the main topics of this section, love and death. So what are the flowers mentioned here? First is the Aquilegia or columbine. These are 2 common names for this flower. It's a flowering plant that is very widespread, not only in the mountain areas, but general in Central Europe. I don't know about other continents, but here it's very common. It comes in many different colors, so there's a lot of variety, but it's easily recognizable by its very characteristic flower shape. So it's even growing in my garden, and here are a few pictures of columbines from my own garden. And the interesting thing here is, of course, not the botanical detail, but the symbolic meaning of this flower. And this has a very strong link with the symbolic meaning since the ancient times. In the antiquity, the columbine flower was dedicated to the goddess of Freya, the goddess of the German goddess or Germanic goddess of fertility. And at the latest, from the Middle Ages on, it was thought to be an aphrodisiac. So it means something to help stimulating the sexual arousal of your own, of the people who ingested it, but also of other people. And according to a popular belief in Europe, it's simply touching a woman with a hand in which powdered columbine seeds had previously been rubbed. This was enough to arouse this woman sexually and to make her submissive. So, and then there's a flower mentioned, the wild carnation. Unfortunately, I don't have an own photo from the alpine variant of wild carnation, but it looks similar to this flower here, similar to this alpine flowering plant. So it's not red. It usually has this sort of tone, I don't know, something between pink and lilac, violet, and looks similar to that one, except that the edges of the petals are usually like a little bit toothed. So unlike the red carnation, which is very well known as an international symbol for socialism, the wild carnations have a different meaning. They are a symbol of friendship, love, and also physical attraction. So also into the same direction here. And then there's gentian, also a symbol of love, in particular the blue gentian. Again, a picture I took in the Alps here, in the Italian region of Piedmont. It's a symbol of particularly friendship, in faithfulness, in love. And then there's the meadow orchis mentioned, and the botanical name orchis comes from the testicle-like appearance of the root tubers. So in ancient time, again, the flower made of the tubers was a highly prized means of allegedly regaining male fertility and sexual power. And in some areas, even today in Europe, the plant is still called love orchis today. So Thomas Mann here uses four flowering plants as examples of the changes in the mountain flora, and all of these flowering plants, at least in the popular belief and superstition and mythology, have some strong symbolic connection to love, and predominantly to the sensual, physical love, to sexual arousal, and to male potency, for fertility. And only one flower seems a bit out of line here, and that's the autumn crocus. And yeah, I think, but still this makes sense, because due to its very late flowering time, it is considered a harbinger of winter, and thus it stands for transience and for melancholy, and so, which is very fitting for this novel. Melancholy is one of the most important topics in the Magic Mountain, and it's a highly toxic plant. It's a deadly poison, and so because of this high toxicity, it also stands for death, and that doesn't surprise me either, because death is of course also present on the Berghof as a constant threat. And we have already spoken earlier about the narrator's remarks that there's a strong link, strange connection between love, erotic love, and death at the Berghof that gives the erotic adventures this particularly feverish and desperate character. So I've been talking about botany and symbolism for a while now. So you could ask, so why so much fuss about a few mountain flowers? I have devoted some time to this because I consider this short section about the mountain flora to be an excellent example of Thomas Mann's detailed working technique. So this is a good example how densely worked this novel is. So hardly any detail is arbitrary or random. In fact, you could get the impression that every word, every object that is described, that was extremely carefully and consciously chosen with regard to all the possible nuances of meaning, of symbolism, of connotations, and other associations. So you can also see this part of the video as an invitation to take a closer look at other individual sections of the novel on your own, and to go down some rabbit hole there. I find it truly amazing what interesting and revealing sidetracks you can come across when looking into the details of the novels. And along the way, you always learn something about what constitutes careful, high-quality writing. One last side note on the subject of nature as a symbol in this novel. Now, not in relation to plants, but to animals as symbols. I also noticed that the narrator repeatedly uses comparisons with bird species for both Madame Chauchat and Hans. And in the German original, it's always emphasized by an alliteration with the adjective that is preceding. That doesn't work in the English version, where we talk about a healthy goose and a healthy bullfinch. In German is this gesunde Gans or gesundes Gänschen and gesunder Gimpel. There's always this alliteration. But however, still we have this parallelity of two bird species used to describe Hans and Madame Chauchat. And with Madame Chauchat, this bird species is used as a contrast. So she's not like a healthy goose. And I think this makes sense because geese symbolize protection, motherly care. They are closely related, associated with vigilant brood care, fertility and motherliness. And Madame Chauchat is none of these things. So we learned she has no children. She will probably never have children because of her health conditions. And so it makes sense to make this contrast. So she is not like a goose. And for Hans, the term bullfinch comes into play in the context of a self-reflection where Hans hopes that Madame Chauchat does not consider him to be just a healthy bullfinch from the lowlands. And the characteristics of a bullfinch are perhaps not quite as obvious and well known as those of a goose. I had to look it up too. The bullfinch is an outwardly very decorative bird, and which fits with the value that Hans places on proper outward appearances. So he appreciates his high quality clothing. And in German, the bird had also a second name, sort of a nickname, Dompfaff, that you could translate literally into something like dome parson or cathedral parson. And I think this also fits nicely with Hans' self-assessment that he would also be suitable for a clerical profession. I think we know that he dreamed about being a clerical person, wearing clerical clothes and looking solemnly at the morning at the people, and etc. So, but what I find most important is the character trait that is usually associated with the bullfinch. It used to symbolize clumsiness, but even more so gullibility. Especially because it was a bird that was particularly easy to catch and to tame. It was easy to catch it with decoys and with lime sticks. So I think this also fits well with the way that Hans Castorp is characterized in the novel as a person who has no firm position of his own and was very easily captivated by Madame Chauchat's charms. Okay, let's move on to number 4, as time goes by. Of course, a section on time should not be missing in this video either. A lot has already been said about time in the novel, and some of it has been sort of repetitive also. But for me, this section actually adds a new thought right at the beginning of the section, Whims of Mercurius. The narrator makes it clear to us that although time is a natural phenomenon, the structuring of time, the division, breaking time down into clearly defined and measurable units, this is a purely human thing. This is something invented and constructed by us, by our need for structure, by our conventions. So nature does not know these structures and measurement units of time. However, the narrator does not devalue the structuring of time, not at all, quite the opposite. For him, the structuring of time is an expression of the human will to order or the human need to order, sort of a rebellion against chaos, an attempt to tame the chaos. And so the orderly management of time, as the narrator calls it, this is a virtue worth striving for, or rather he describes it the other way around from the negative side. So the disorderly management or the mismanagement of time, it's a vice. It's something that goes hand in hand with aimlessness of life and with dissoluteness and slackness and depravity. And so this is a reproach that the narrator makes to Hans. So this slackness or depravity or a form of depravity, this is mentioned here, and it's also now presented to us as a commonality, as a connecting element between Hans Castorp and Madame Chauchat. It is described how Hans used to take offense at Madame Chauchat's slackness, but suddenly he no longer does so because, I quote, something quite different enters in. That that has nothing to do with moral judgments, and it is all up with your severity. You're simply not at home to pedagogic influences. So, and this slackness goes far beyond the disorderly management of time. But management of time and structure of time was just the opportunity for the narrator to start talking about this disorderly management of time and slackness and depravity. Let's move on to the fifth and final point for today, body and soul. This is at the core of the conversation between Hans and Settembrini. And so in this section, Settembrini not only explains this book project where he is going to contribute to, but he also explains his particular ideas about the dualism or antagonism between body and soul, or body and mind. And I think to look into this dialogue in detail could be a 1-hour video of its own. But I will limit myself to just a few highlights here. Firstly, I was a bit surprised that in some places now a much more positive picture of Settembrini is painted here than before. He seeks to talk to Hans with, quote, benevolence and freedom from prejudice. So he shows a genuine interest in the well-being of Hans. And despite all the differences, you can sense that he really has a genuine interest in protecting Hans from the dangers of the Berghof, or at least warning Hans of these dangers. In terms of content, the positions that Settembrini represents are not particularly surprising. It's a detailed, but I think picture, but I think a familiar one to the attentive reader. So he seems to have an almost Calvinistic, Protestantic ethos of work and utility, of being useful as a high virtue. He sees spiritual self-improvement and so personal growth as an important goal of human activity. He is a fighter for a fighter for the positive influence of reason and spirit. And so he's also a very avowed opponent of the human body's susceptibility to death and eros. And he sees these eros and death as forces that oppose reason. And in explaining this, he ties in seamlessly with the ideas of the Enlightenment, but also of the slightly later German classicism, which saw reason and art and literature oriented towards perfection of form as an alternative means, as an alternative to the destructive forces of nature and human instincts. I can only touch on this here briefly, but the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, mentioned by Settembrini here, it actually was one of the triggers for a crisis, an intellectual crisis among European intellectuals at the time. So all this previous concept of theodicy, of the conviction that nature and reason were in some sort of harmony, that we lived, as the philosopher Leibniz put it, probably not in a perfect world, but in the best of all possible worlds, that there was a reason behind everything that happens. This belief was, or illusion was torn apart by this shocking catastrophe, where so many innocent lives were extinct, this meaningless catastrophe. And a short time later, there was the French Revolution, initially acclaimed by the progressive thinkers as a means of liberty, equality, fraternité. But very quickly, Europe realized with horror that not only nature is cruelly unreasonable, but also the changes begun by humans with positive ambitions. They can get completely out of control and end in plain terror. So both the nature that surrounds us and the human nature they have an evil, irrational side. So there's this sequence of instincts leading to terror, leading to death. So this is what Settembrini is accusing. So he said it would be cowardly and servile to simply accept this or to give into it. What Settembrini propagates here as a counter movement is a sort of modified program of the Enlightenment. It's a bit modified because he also explicitly mentions aesthetic categories such as the beauty to be defended, and this makes me think more of the slightly later program of the German classicism, so which is of course deeply rooted in the Enlightenment, but represents more a system with a focus more in aesthetic and also the development of further practical development of practical aspects. So this concept is mainly based on three pillars: aesthetic, autonomy, education, and humanity. And I think these are three values that Settembrini is very much putting forward here in this section. Whatever, not going into the philosophical details here, I have the impression that at least in the last 3 pages, provoked by Hans, Settembrini talks himself into a rage, and he takes off to an intellectual altitude where Hans can no longer follow. In my mind, Hans looks a little bit like a schoolboy being told off at the end of the section, but perhaps maybe this was precisely Settembrini's educational intention. Who knows? A few more sentences on the book project that Settembrini describes here. So this is sort of nerdy stuff. This is a result of some rabbit hole I ran into. So if you're not interested in this stuff, just feel free to skip it. But this sociology of suffering, this is the title of the book that Settembrini mentions here. This sociology, different word to pronounce for a German mouth, in which all forms of human suffering are to be systematically presented and described from the perspective of sociology. This is an interesting piece of work. The idea is that human suffering, so not just illness, but suffering in the broader sense, in most cases has some causes that can be described in a sociological way. For example, they are rooted in a certain social or family constellation, in constraints, in emergency situations. And this is an interesting approach to systematically record and describe and classify all these types of suffering, and to come up with proposals for concrete solutions to address these types of suffering, both theoretical ones and empirically proven ones, and ways of dealing or lay out ways of dealing with this sort of suffering as described in the past in literature and in the other arts. And the fascinating thing is that such an ambitious book project with precisely the same title as Sociology of Suffering, and with precisely the objective and structure as described by Settembrini, it actually existed. It was written by a German author, Franz Müller-Lyer. He was a medic, psychiatrist, and a sociologist. Today he's only remembered for a specific optical illusion he discovered, and that was named after him, the Müller-Lyer illusion. However, Müller-Lyer was somebody who also loved to explain the world to his contemporaries. So he was a very prolific writer. He was a typical representative of this optimistic type of scientists at the beginning of the 20th century, when it was thought that the whole world could be easily described, explained, it made controllable by means of setting up just the right system and explaining it to the people. And with this attitude, with this educational attitude, Müller-Lyer also tried to explain the world in all its facets to his contemporaries. So he penned some books with modest titles such as The Meaning of Life in 1910, or Forms of Marriage, Family and Kinship, 1911. Phases of Love, 1913. And in 1914, this very book, Sociology of Suffering, was published. And as described by Settembrini, the work was planned to consist of many volumes, really addressing all types of sufferings, but it was interrupted after the first volume due to the sudden death of the author in 1916. So we only have this first volume. The work is just a fragment. And Müller-Lyr's aim, as Settembrini described it, was actually that to collect and then systematize all sorts of suffering, of human suffering as completely as possible, and to collect and describe, to view and classify, and then to analyze the causes and give some indications for possible remedies. And so, in order to ultimately use this knowledge to, for example, in political action programs, for example. And in this first volume, Müller-Lyer developed at least the systematic framework and a classification system for all types of suffering. And here I provide a few screenshots from this book. Unfortunately, it's only available in German, so I'm not going to translate it. I think we see that is a typically scientist-like approach to categorize elements. And he developed the structure in this first volume, and he also described the structure in which all these sufferings should then be described in the subsequent volumes. So all this was actually intended to be a multi-volume handbook with profiles, fact sheets for each type of suffering, with the causes and solutions, and also a section describing the literary material in each case. So how this suffering or its underlying conflicts have been treated in literature or other arts. So in other words, also that part that Settembrini is tasked with in the Magic Mountain novel was actually foreseen in the real book. So this was perhaps a sort of nerdy digression on a somewhat off-topic subject, but in my opinion, this is also a good example, first, for the working technique of Thomas Mann, who was obviously very well read and informed on sociological and other scientific and social topics of his time, and who used a lot of actually existing material to build it into his work. So many of the elements are not invented, but he uses existing elements, he just modifies them, transforms them, and uses them in the context of his novel where they fit best. And secondly, it's also a good example for the spiritual and intellectual climate at the time the novel was written and at the time of the novel's plot. I think with today's knowledge, what happened shortly after, so with the imminent outbreak of World War I think we're sometimes a little bit in danger of having a narrow view of the events and of the political and societal discussions of the time. That we are trying to narrow it down to dichotomies, all of them driven by our knowledge about the imminent war. So these dichotomies like reactionary versus progressive, warmonger versus pacifist, monarchist versus republican, nationalist versus socialist. But I think this falls short. The reality was probably much broader, and there was much more variety. I think the spectrum of social and sociological topics discussed in this society was much broader, and there were certainly also very optimistic, ambitious, philanthropic discourses, as we can see in this book project by Müller-Lyer. Even if it may seem somewhat naive and optimistic from today's perspective, I think still it was a very laudable, visionary draft by someone who was obviously able to think far beyond the boundaries of his own profession and discipline, and who was aware of his social responsibility as a scientist. Okay, that brings me to the end. I have the feeling that the videos are getting longer and longer. Let's see where this will take us along the rest of the novel. In any case, I had a lot of fun again, and I look forward to your feedback and your comments. The next video will be released in about a week from now, so during the first week of November, and it will be about the next two sections of chapter 5. So in the English translation that I'm reading, the sections are titled Humaniora and Research. Okay, until then, take care, enjoy reading, bye and ciao.